I woke up before dawn with that familiar surge of heat crawling up my spine, the kind of pain that makes you feel like your bones are grinding against each other. A flare-up always came uninvited, but this one felt vicious from the moment I opened my eyes. My lower back throbbed in waves that rolled down both legs until my toes curled. I lay still for a moment, breathing through the tightness, waiting for the room to stop tilting. Then I pushed myself upright, every movement stiff and slow, and reached for the nightstand where I kept my medication. The drawer slid open with a soft scrape that sounded louder than usual. My hand hovered above the empty space. At first, I just stared. The bottle should have been right there in the front left corner where I always kept it. I pushed deeper inside the drawer, feeling around for something that was not there. The space felt cold. My heart started to pound harder than the pain. I tried to think. I had refilled the prescription yesterday at the pharmacy on 38th Street. I remembered placing the new bottle in the drawer, closing it, patting the top like I always did before heading into the kitchen. I remembered feeling relieved because flare-ups had been coming more often recently, and the idea of running out terrified me. But the bottle was gone now, completely gone. A hot wave of panic rose in my chest. I sat back, gripping the edge of the bed, trying to steady my breathing. Pain does strange things to your mind. It twists memory and confidence into soft clay, so I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe I had moved it without thinking. Maybe I had left it in my coat pocket or set it on the kitchen counter. I told myself not to jump to conclusions, even though conclusions were already forming sharp and fast. I stood up, legs trembling under me, and took a few slow steps toward the dresser. Nothing. I checked the bathroom cabinet, then my coat, my purse, even the laundry basket. The pain made everything blur, but I kept going, finally. I returned to the bedroom and leaned against the wall, pressing my palm to it to steady myself. The bottle was not anywhere in the house. I knew it with the kind of certainty that feels like someone snapping a rubber band inside your chest. A memory flickered, a soft thump downstairs the night before. Footsteps. I had assumed it was the neighbor closing his door, but now I was not so sure. My phone buzzed, pulling me out of my thoughts. A text from my father. He rarely texted this early. It said simply, "Do not worry about coming to the reading tomorrow. You should rest." Rest! It was such an odd word coming from him. He never suggested rest. He never suggested anything to me unless my mother asked him to. My hands shook as I read the message again. I wanted to pretend it was thoughtful, but something about it felt rehearsed, like he was sending words that did not belong to him. Pain surged up my spine and I had to sit on the floor before my legs gave out. I curled forward, pressing my forehead to my knees until the tremor eased. When I lifted my head again, my phone buzzed a second time. This time it was the call I had been expecting yet also dreading. Lucas Reed, the Whitford family attorney, a man with a steady voice and a way of speaking that always made me feel like he saw more than he let on. I let the phone ring once before answering. I did not have the strength to sound normal, so I did not try. "Lucas," I whispered, "I am in a bad flare-up. I am not sure I can make it tomorrow." He paused before speaking, and something in that pause made my heart tighten. "Claire," he said, "the meeting tomorrow is not optional. Your grandfather asked for you specifically. He said there is something you need to know, something that should have been told to you years ago, something from 2011. My throat closed. 2011, the year of the fall. The year my life changed without an explanation that ever made sense. I felt cold even though sweat was sliding down my back. Lucas continued, "He insisted you hear it in person. He will not proceed without you." I closed my eyes. My pulse fluttered against my ribs. My grandfather had been the only person in my family who ever looked at me without impatience or judgment. If he said there was something I needed to hear, then he meant it, even if the idea terrified me. "I will come," I said, though my voice broke. I do not know how, but I will be there. When the call ended, the house felt too quiet, like it was listening. My thoughts swirled in a slow, heavy loop. The missing medication, the strange message from my father, my mother's subtle questions the day before, my grandfather insisting on my presence. The year 2011 rising like a shadow I had spent more than a decade trying not to think about. Another sharp throb shot through my lower back, and I clutched the edge of the mattress until my fingers ached. Without the medication, The pain was worsening fast. I knew I needed help. I needed answers even more. I lifted myself back onto the bed, inch by inch. The room dimmed at the edges, and for a moment I thought I might faint. I breathed slowly until the dizziness passed. Then I stared again at the open drawer, the empty space where the pill bottle should have been, the small hollow in the wood that held nothing but dust. Someone had been in my house. Someone had taken the only thing that kept me standing upright. Someone did not want me at that meeting. I reached for my phone again, my hand shaking so badly I almost dropped it. Pain pressed against my ribs like a clenched fist. The sky outside the window was turning from dark blue to pale gray. Morning was coming whether I was ready or not. I sat there in the dim light of my bedroom, fighting the ache that climbed through my spine, and let the truth settle over me as heavily as the pain itself. Whatever waited for me in that room with my grandfather, whatever secret had been buried since 2011, someone in my own family wanted it to stay hidden. And if they were willing to take away my medication to stop me, then tomorrow was going to hurt in ways I had not even begun to understand. The flare-up pulsed again, and I closed my eyes, bracing myself for whatever came next. I opened my eyes again, not sure how much time had passed. The pain had settled into a deep, twisting ache, the kind that makes your whole body feel older than it is. I shifted carefully and reached for the blanket, trying to pull it over my legs, but the muscle in my lower back seized and I froze until the spasm eased. When I finally managed to sit up, the room looked strangely small, as if every wall had moved a little closer. I needed answers. I needed clarity, because confusion was beginning to feel almost as heavy as the pain. I pushed myself off the bed and walked slowly into the hallway, one hand sliding along the wall for balance. The house felt unnervingly quiet, like a breath held too long. I stopped at the top of the stairs and let my eyes rest on the closed front door. If someone had been inside the night before, there was no trace now. No open latch, no footprint on the mat, no sign of a break-in. Whoever it was had known exactly what they were doing. My phone buzzed softly in my pocket. It took effort just to pull it out. There was a new message from Emily. She rarely contacted me unless it was something my mother asked her to relay. The message read, "I heard you were not feeling great. Maybe it is best you skip the reading tomorrow. Grandpa would understand." I read it twice. The words looked supportive on the surface, but something in them rang hollow. Emily had never once suggested what was best for me. She had only ever suggested what was easiest for her. I set the phone down on the small table near the stairs and stood there, letting the ache climb up the right side of my spine. My breathing sounded loud in the silence, and the stillness of the house made my skin prickle. It struck me then how long this distance between us had existed. Emily and I had grown up under the same roof, but somehow we had lived two entirely different childhoods. She was the lively one, the charming one, the daughter teachers praised and neighbors admired. I was the one who bruised easily, who needed rest after gym class, who spent more afternoons in doctors' offices than at birthday parties. When the fall happened in 2011, I had woken up with a bruised back and a fractured memory. Yet Emily had been the one comforted. I had been told it was a simple accident. She had been told nothing was her fault. I leaned on the railing and felt my throat tighten. It was strange how memories you had not thought about in years could suddenly grow sharp again. I remembered sitting at the dinner table one night not long after the fall, mentioning that my back ached. My mother had sighed and said I was always exaggerating. My father had nodded. Emily had looked down at her plate, saying nothing. She was the only one who would not meet my eyes. I turned away from the stairs and went into the kitchen, searching again in places I knew the medication would not be. The ache behind my ribs grew heavier each time my search turned up nothing. I checked the cabinet by the sink, the small drawer where I kept pens, the basket of receipts near the fridge, all empty. The truth was unavoidable. Someone had taken the medication deliberately, and whoever it was knew exactly how much I depended on it. A sharp jolt of pain shot through my lower back, and I braced myself on the counter. I swallowed hard and tried to steady my breathing. My mother had always said pain was part of life, that I needed to push through it instead of relying so much on medication. She said it with the tone of someone who believed their own perspective was simply fact. But she was not the one whose legs buckled without warning. She was not the one who woke up some mornings feeling like a bolt of lightning had lodged itself between her vertebrae. She was not the one who needed to walk into a room tomorrow morning without collapsing. My phone buzzed again. This time it was from my father asking if I had seen his earlier message. There was a line saying he hoped I would not stress myself out. The words felt disconnected from the man I knew. My father was not the type to worry about stress. He was the type to say, "You keep going until the job is done." I put the phone down without responding. The pain pulsed again and I let out a shaky breath. I walked back to my bedroom, forcing my mind to stay clear even as my body screamed for relief. It was not lost on me that every sign pointed to someone wanting me too weak to attend that reading. And it was not lost on me who had access to my house. Janet still had a spare key. My father knew the layout of this place better than I did. And Emily had a habit of borrowing things without asking whenever she decided she needed them. But why now? Why this moment? Why right before the reading, I sat at the edge of the bed, letting the question drift around me. Something about 2011 had always felt incomplete, like a story told with a missing chapter. I had tried to leave it alone, tried to accept the version I was given, but my grandfather had insisted on seeing me. My family was behaving like they wanted me nowhere near him. And my medication, the one thing that could help me stand upright during a flare, had vanished overnight. I pressed my hands together, feeling my pulse between my palms. A small part of me whispered that I was being dramatic, that maybe I had misplaced the bottle after all. That voice had lived inside me since childhood. It was the echo of my mother's sigh, my father's silence, Emily's dismissive smiles. But there was another voice too, quieter yet stronger. It told me that my instincts had been right all along. Something in my family had never been what it seemed. I pushed myself up slowly, step by step, moving toward the living room. The morning light was creeping in through the blinds, painting pale stripes on the rug. My grandfather had always said morning light was a truth teller. He said the darkest things looked different once the sun touched them. I walked to the window and watched the pale glow spread across the street. It felt like the start of something, not something gentle, but something inevitable. I was still staring outside when my phone rang again. This time it was Marcus. His name glowing on the screen sent a flutter of apprehension through me. I answered as quickly as my stiff fingers allowed. His voice was steady but tinged with concern. He asked how the pain was. I told him the truth. He asked about the missing medication. I heard myself say the words "someone took it" and realized how real it sounded when spoken aloud. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he told me to come in as soon as I could. There were things he needed to discuss with me, things that might help explain what was happening. I told him I would try. He said he would be waiting and that I should not go anywhere near the reading without a proper dose in my system. There was urgency in his voice that made me straighten a little despite the pain. When the call ended, I stood still in the center of my living room, breathing through the heaviness in my spine. The house no longer felt quiet in a peaceful way. It felt like a room where too many truths had been kept hidden. I reached for my coat, every movement slow and deliberate, and slipped it over my shoulders. If someone wanted me weak, they had miscalculated. Pain was not new to me. Being pushed aside was not new either. I had spent years believing the story I was given about my own life. Maybe tomorrow I would finally hear the one that had been kept from me. I steadied myself, opened the front door, and stepped into the cold morning air, unaware of how much the next few hours would change everything I thought I knew. I pulled the door shut behind me and locked it, then steadied myself on the porch railing while another tremor moved up my spine. The cold air helped clear my head a little. I walked slowly toward my car, each step careful and measured, trying to keep the pain from spreading too quickly. By the time I settled behind the wheel, my hands were trembling and my lower back felt like it had a knot the size of a fist pulling tighter and tighter. The drive to Tacoma General was only 15 minutes, but it felt longer. Traffic lights turned into small tests of endurance. My breathing shortened each time I had to shift or turn. I kept one hand pressed against the seat beside me, trying to brace myself whenever the car jolted over a crack in the road. By the time I pulled into the parking garage, my shirt clung to my back with sweat. Inside the hospital lobby, the fluorescent lights made me blink several times before my eyes adjusted. Marcus had told me to come straight to his office on the second floor. I took the elevator because stairs were not an option today. When the doors opened, I stepped out and followed the hallway lined with framed photographs of donors. My reflection in the glass looked pale, almost whack. His office door was slightly open. I knocked gently and stepped inside when I heard his voice. Marcus was sorting through a stack of charts on his desk. But he stopped when he saw me. His expression shifted from professional calm to genuine concern. He stood and walked around the desk, guiding me toward the chair. He asked how bad the pain was. I told him truthfully that I had been fighting it since dawn, and that the flare-up was worse than anything I had experienced in months. He asked about the missing medication, and I explained everything I had found, or rather, had not found. Marcus sat back and rubbed the corner of his jaw with his thumb as he listened. When I finished, he opened a folder on his desk and pulled out a printed log. These are the refill modifications submitted to your chart last week. Time-stamped and approved. The handwriting is masked because it is an electronic entry, but the access ID belongs to someone who logged in through a volunteer credential. My stomach tightened. My mother had volunteered at the hospital years earlier. She still had friends here. She still visited sometimes, bringing cookies to the nurses on weekends. She had been a part of this place longer than I had been a patient here. Marcus continued. The system flagged it during our internal audit. We have been reviewing medication-related irregularities from the past 3 years. Your file stood out because your dosage reduction request was submitted at a time when you were actively reporting increased pain. That alone was concerning. But there is more. He opened a second folder, this one thicker. He tapped a page lightly. Someone called my office last week asking for details about your prescription. They knew your date of birth, your insurance, even the name of your old physical therapist. The caller claimed to be you, but the voice was not yours. A wave of cold moved down my arms. My hands gripped the sides of the chair. I asked him if the voice had sounded familiar. He shook his head slowly and said it was female, steady, confident. He also mentioned that the caller asked specifically about the new dosage and refill timing, questions a patient would only ask if they were preparing for a flare-up, not if they were trying to reduce medication. I sat there in silence for a moment. The pain made my thoughts feel thick, but the logic behind everything was becoming impossible to ignore. Someone had wanted to know exactly when I would be vulnerable. Someone had wanted to time it. Marcus stood and walked to the small cabinet behind his desk. He pulled out a temporary prescription bottle and handed it to me. Take one as soon as you get to your car. Do not wait. You will need it for tomorrow. I nodded, grateful in a way that went beyond words. He hesitated, then said something that made the hairs on my arms stand up. Claire, the audit yielded something else. There is a video file connected to your chart. It was not shot inside a patient room. It is from a restricted area. Someone should not have been there. The clip is dated from last year, during one of your earlier flare-ups. I asked him if he could show it to me. He shook his head gently. I cannot release it yet, not without clearance, but you will see it tomorrow if the attorney presents it. He added in a low voice that he hoped I had someone to support me during the reading. I swallowed hard. My grandfather was the only one who had ever done that without question. Marcus returned to his desk. His voice softened when he spoke again. I have known your family for a long time. Your mother was respected here, but when someone abuses access or interferes with care, the consequences are serious. I nodded even though the idea of seeing my mother as anything other than stern and controlling felt surreal. I leaned forward, my elbows on my knees, trying to ease the pressure in my lower back. I asked Marcus if he thought the flare-up had been triggered on purpose. He did not answer immediately. Then he said he had seen stranger things in family disputes, and that timing meant everything. He added that anyone who knew my condition well would know that interrupting my medication at the wrong moment could leave me incapacitated for days. The room felt suddenly smaller. I rubbed my forehead and tried to piece together everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. The missing medication, my father's text telling me not to come, Emily's message echoing the same sentiment, my mother hovering the day before, her eyes following me with an intensity I could not understand at the time. Now, the idea of her accessing the medication room and making adjustments to my record no longer felt far-fetched. Marcus asked if I needed assistance getting back to my car. I told him I could manage if I took it slow. He reminded me to use the temporary prescription as soon as I reached the parking garage, then to rest for the remainder of the day. I stood carefully, steadying myself on the arm of the chair. He guided me to the door, and for a moment, as I stepped into the hallway, I felt like he wanted to say more but chose not to. The hallway outside his office was lined with posters about pain management and patient advocacy. The irony struck me. Advocacy had never been something my family offered me. Instead, I had learned to advocate for myself in small ways, hiding the severity of the pain, working through hours of discomfort, pretending I did not need support because I knew support was not coming. I reached the elevator and pressed the button, listening to the hum of machinery. Behind the doors, the elevator arrived with a soft ding and I stepped inside, leaning back against the wall as it carried me down to the lobby. When the doors opened, the cold air drifting in from the entrance hit me like relief. Walking across the parking garage, I noticed how unsteady my steps were, as if my legs had forgotten their usual rhythm. When I reached the car, I opened the bottle Marcus had given me and swallowed a pill with the bottled water I kept in the console. Within minutes, the pain softened from a cutting edge to a dull roar. I sat behind the wheel for a moment, letting my breath settle. The sunlight was brighter now, filling the garage with thin bands of gold. I knew I should drive home and rest, but another thought pushed through the haze. If my family was involved, if they had been interfering with my care for longer than I realized, then there were pieces of the story I had not yet uncovered. I started the engine, but instead of turning toward the exit, I sat there with my hands on the wheel, listening to the quiet thrum of the motor as the weight of the morning pressed down on me. The truth was beginning to show its outline, faint but undeniable, and I knew that whatever happened next, I could not turn away from it. I let the engine idle while my mind churned, then finally pulled out of the parking garage and onto the street. The medication Marcus gave me had started to dull the sharper edges of the pain, leaving a heavy throbbing that made it possible to breathe without gritting my teeth. I drove slowly through the late morning traffic, watching people hurry into coffee shops, couples walking dogs, students cutting across intersections with backpacks slung over one shoulder. Ordinary life, moving forward as if nothing in the world had shifted. But something had shifted for me, and I could feel the change like a quiet vibration under my ribs. Instead of turning toward home, I headed for Old Town Tacoma. The closer I got, the more certain I felt about what I needed to do. My Aunt Rose had always been the one person in my extended family who saw through the polished surface of things. She had never said much, but she noticed everything. And she had been there in 2011, hovering around the edges of every conversation, watching my parents with the kind of frown that made me think she heard what others tried to hide. Her bookstore sat on a quiet corner near a row of antique shops. The wooden sign above the door still had the hand-painted lettering she had done herself years ago. I parked out front and walked slowly to the entrance. When I pushed the door open, the small bell above it chimed softly, that familiar sound that always reminded me of after-school visits when I was younger, and Rose let me sit behind the counter reading whatever I picked from the shelves. The smell of old paper and cedar hit me as soon as I stepped inside. Rose was standing on a small step stool, arranging books on the top shelf. She looked over her shoulder when she heard the bell and smiled, but the smile faded the moment she saw my face. "Claire, honey, what happened?" She climbed down quickly and came toward me. Her eyes flicked over me with worry, taking in the tightness of my posture and the way I was holding my lower back. I shook my head, trying to steady my voice. "It is a long story. I need to ask you something. Something important." She guided me to the small table near the front window, the one she kept for customers who liked to sit and read. I eased into the chair and took a slow breath. The sunlight through the window warmed my shoulder, but my hands felt cold against the wooden tabletop. I told her about the missing medication, my parents' strange messages, and the conversation with Marcus. I told her about the audit and the volunteer login and the voice pretending to be me. The more I spoke, the more her expression shifted, moving from concern to something darker. Finally, she sat back and folded her arms. I knew something was wrong. I have known for years, but I did not know it had gotten this far. I asked her what she meant. She sighed and pressed her fingers to her temple as if trying to organize her thoughts. "Do you remember 2011? Of course I did. Or at least the parts that had not blurred over time. I told her I remembered falling, waking up in the hospital with a splitting headache, and being told it was an accident. She nodded slowly. "That is what they wanted you to believe. But even back then, things did not add up. I saw Emily outside near the garage right before the paramedics arrived. She looked terrified. And Janet would not let me speak to either of you, every time I tried." She interrupted, Every single time. I felt a cold weight settle at the base of my throat. I asked her if she thought the fall was not an accident. Rose leaned forward. I cannot tell you exactly what happened. I was not there when it happened. But I can tell you this. CPS opened a file after the hospital reported inconsistencies in the injury. They thought someone might have pushed you. The bruising pattern, the angle of the fracture. It did not match a simple tumble. Your parents panicked. They found a way to bury the file. Someone moved it into archive status within 48 hours. That is not normal. A slow wave of nausea rose up the back of my throat. I stared at the worn edge of the table, trying to process her words. She reached across and touched my hand lightly. One more thing, Claire. Your grandfather tried writing to you after the fall. He told me he wanted to explain something, but every envelope he sent came back unopened. Janet told him you did not want to talk about it, but I saw her burn one of the letters in her backyard fire pit. It was addressed to you. The room tilted slightly and I closed my eyes until it steadied. My mother burning a letter meant for me. My mother who insisted she did everything for my own good. My mother who had always controlled every detail of my care, from doctor visits to medication schedules. I opened my eyes again. Why did you not tell me before? Rose looked down for a moment, then back at me. Every time I tried. Your mother would insert herself before I could finish a sentence. And you were so fragile back then. I did not want to cause you more pain without something concrete. But your grandfather had a plan. He said he had kept something, a video. He said if the truth ever had to come out, that video would explain everything. And he was adamant. Janet must never see it before you did. The breath caught in my chest. A video? Something my grandfather had kept hidden all these years. It struck me then how much he must have feared losing control of the truth. How much he must have feared my mother and what she would do if she knew he had evidence of what happened. Do you know where the video is? My voice felt thin. Rose shook her head. He never told me. But he told Lucas. He trusted him. If it is going to surface, it will be tomorrow. The thought of sitting in that room with my parents, with Emily, while some hidden truth played out on a screen made my stomach twist. But there was also a small flicker of something else. Relief. Not the kind that came from comfort, but the kind that came from finally having a path forward. Rose squeezed my hand. You need to be ready for whatever that video shows. I have known your mother a long time. She does not do anything unless she is terrified of something. Remember that. I nodded slowly. Her words felt like they were settling deep into me, stitching connections between moments that had never made sense before. My mother hovering over me, controlling information, making decisions without asking. Emily avoiding my eyes whenever the subject of the fall came up. My father quietly following whatever was easiest, even if it meant ignoring the truth. Rose asked gently if I wanted some tea. I declined. My body felt too tense to swallow anything. Instead, I stood slowly, waiting for the stiff pull in my back to settle into something manageable. She rose with me and put her hands on my shoulders for a moment. Whatever happens tomorrow, Claire, you are not imagining things. You never were. Her words traveled through me like a tremor. I nodded once and walked toward the door, each step measured and slow. When I stepped outside, the sunlight felt colder, sharper, as if the air itself had changed in the last hour. I stood beside my car for a long moment, one hand resting on the roof for balance. My reflection in the window looked like someone caught between two lives, the one I had been given and the one I was about to uncover. The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of salt from the bay. I inhaled deeply, then carefully lowered myself into the driver's seat. Tomorrow would come whether I was ready or not, and whatever truth my grandfather had kept hidden all these years was waiting for me on the other side of it. I sat behind the wheel for a moment, letting the quiet steady me before turning the key in the ignition. The engine rumbled softly, and I rested my hands on the cold steering wheel, trying to gather myself. The drive home blurred by in pieces, street signs and shop windows and rows of winter bare trees passing like shadows. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the temporary medication had settled into my system, softening the worst of the pain enough that I could move without holding my breath. Inside the house, the stillness felt different now, not just quiet, but expectant, as if the walls themselves were waiting for something to be revealed. I locked the door behind me out of habit, then stood in the foyer a moment to steady my breathing. My thoughts were racing in slow, heavy circles. The missing medication, the altered dosage, the phone call Marcus described, the file archived in 2011, the video my grandfather had kept hidden, and the way Rose had looked at me, worried but certain, as if she had been waiting years for me to start asking these questions. I walked toward the bedroom, each step sending a dull throb down my spine. I pushed the door open and hesitated. The room looked the same as always, but now there was a weight in the air that had not been there before. I crossed to the dresser, opened the same drawer I had opened that morning, and looked again at the empty space that once held my medication. I touched the inside corner where I always stored the bottle. The wood felt cold, too cold. I closed the drawer and turned toward the small shelf near the window where the router and my home security system monitor sat. I had almost forgotten about the cameras. 2 of them, both motion activated. One in the living room near the hallway entrance, another aimed toward my bedroom door. My hands shook slightly as I picked up the tablet that linked to the recordings. The flares of pain made my vision blur for a second. I blinked hard until the screen came into focus. I selected the footage from the last 72 hours and scrubbed through the timestamps. There was nothing unusual at first. Me walking to the kitchen, me sitting at the table with a heating pad, me heading upstairs for bed. Then, around 11:40 the previous night, motion detection lit up on the timeline. My breath caught as the screen shifted to the living room feed. A figure stepped into the frame. A woman. Her posture was unmistakable. My mother. Janet wore a soft gray coat I had seen her wear countless times. She walked with that brisk but careful stride of hers, the stride of someone used to being efficient. She moved across my living room as if it were her own. No hesitation, no uncertainty. She held something in her hand that I could not see clearly. I watched her walk down the hallway toward my bedroom. The second camera picked her up as she stepped through the doorway. She went straight to my nightstand. She opened the drawer. She did not search. She reached directly for the spot where the bottle should have been. She removed it. Then from her coat pocket, she pulled out another bottle, a white pharmacy bottle that looked identical at a glance. She placed it in my drawer, closed it calmly, and stood there for a moment. She touched the surface of the nightstand, almost gently. Then she lifted her phone from her pocket. I turned up the volume. Her voice came through softly but clearly. "It is done. She will not be able to stand tomorrow." A few seconds passed before a second voice responded. "Emily." The tone was steady, almost casual. "Good. Make sure the original bottle is gone. She cannot show up like last time." My chest tightened. I replayed the audio, then paused the footage and stared at the frozen image of my mother standing in my bedroom. It felt as if the floor shifted under me. My mother had always been strict, always controlling, but seeing her in my home like that made something in me fracture a little. I clicked ahead in the footage. A moment later, my father appeared near the end of the hallway. He was not in the bedroom. Instead, he stood near the bottom of the stairs, his expression tense and unreadable. He looked toward the bedroom, then glanced away. He did not say anything. He did not intervene. He simply turned and walked out of the frame, disappearing back toward the living room. For a long moment, when I could not breathe. It was one thing to suspect, another to see it with my own eyes. My mother in my room switching medication, my sister on the phone calmly orchestrating it, my father watching silently, then walking away as though none of it mattered. Something inside me went very still. I set the tablet down on the bedspread and leaned forward, pressing my palms against my knees until the shaking in my hands subsided. The quiet of the house no longer felt like quiet at all. It felt like the aftermath of a storm I had never seen coming. Part of me wanted to cry, but the tears did not come. Another part of me wanted to scream, but even that felt too small. Instead, a strange calm spread through me, the kind of calm that comes when the truth becomes too solid to ignore. They had done this deliberately. They had taken from me the one thing that helped me stand, walk, think. They had done it not because they misunderstood me or doubted my condition. They had done it to stop me. I sat there for several long minutes, breathing slowly, letting the truth settle into the cracks of every memory I had questioned growing up. The flare-ups dismissed as exaggeration. The appointments canceled without my consent. The letters from my grandfather that never reached me. the uneasy feeling I had every time my mother spoke about my health as if it were an inconvenience. A faint ringing sound broke the silence. My phone was vibrating in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw my father's name on the screen. I stared at it, letting it ring until it went silent. Another ring followed, this time from my mother. I turned the phone face down without answering. I needed space. I needed time to think, and I needed strength for tomorrow. I stood slowly, pacing myself, letting the medication take the edge off the worst of the pain. The air in the bedroom felt too heavy. So I walked back toward the living room. My legs felt unsteady but determined. I reached for my coat without thinking. The sleeve brushed against my wrist, and I paused, realizing that if I stayed home alone any longer, I might drown in the weight of everything I had just seen. I walked to the front door and pulled it open. The afternoon light poured across the porch, bright and cold. I stepped outside, locked the door behind me, and breathed in the crisp air. There was someone I needed to face tomorrow, but tonight, there was only one place left for me to put all of this. One place where the truth had already begun to surface. One place where the secret that shaped my life had been guarded for years. I stepped off the porch, gripping the railing for balance, and made my way toward the car again, knowing that whatever happened at the reading tomorrow, confrontation was no longer something I feared. It was something I was ready for. I drove through the fading light with a steadiness I did not fully feel, the cold air slipping through the crack in the window, helping me stay alert. By the time I reached Willow Creek Retirement Home, the sky over Tacoma had shifted to a muted lavender, the kind that made every building look softened at the edges. I parked near the side entrance where visitor traffic was lightest. For a moment, I rested both hands on the steering wheel, grounding myself before reaching for my cane in the back seat. The pain had dulled but not disappeared. It hovered low and tense, waiting. Inside the lobby, I checked in with the receptionist who pointed me down the hall toward the conference room. My steps echoed against the tile floor, each one measured, the cane tapping lightly beside me. At the corner near the therapy wing, I paused, breathing through a pull of tension along my lower spine. Then I pushed forward, rounding the final bend. The double doors to the conference room were cracked open. Through the gap, I saw shadows moving. Emily was standing near the window, her posture straight and polished, as if she were preparing for a meeting at the school where she taught. My mother sat near the far end of the table, hands clasped tightly in her lap. My father hovered behind her chair, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. None of them looked toward the door. My grandfather sat at the head of the table in his wheelchair, his shoulders thinner than I remembered, but his eyes still carrying that stubborn clarity he had never lost. When he saw me, something like relief washed across his face. His hand lifted slightly, as if he wanted to greet me but lacked the strength. Lucas Reed, dressed neatly in a navy suit, approached me with a small nod. His expression was serious, more serious than I had ever seen it. He reached out gently to steady my arm as I stepped inside. There was a faint murmur of surprise from my mother when she realized I had arrived. My father looked away. Emily froze for a fraction of a second before schooling her expression into something flat and controlled. I crossed the room slowly, the cane tapping against the carpeted floor. Pain pulsed low but steady. It reminded me that I was not here to appear strong. I was here to hear the truth. I took a seat near my grandfather, angled slightly so I could see both him and the projection screen already set up on the opposite wall. Lucas took his place near the laptop. The air in the room felt charged, almost thick, as if the truth itself had weight. Lucas cleared his throat softly before speaking. Mr. Whitford has requested that certain information be reviewed before we begin any estate matters. He activated the projector, and the blank screen brightened with a faint hum. My mother leaned forward. Her voice trembled slightly. I do not understand why this is necessary. This is a family matter. Lucas did not respond to her. Instead, he pressed a key on the laptop, and a still frame appeared on the screen. It was an image from inside Tacoma General Hospital. The familiar rows of cabinets, the stainless steel counters, the shelf with prescription cartons. My mother inhaled sharply. The video began to play. There she was, stepping into the medication area, using her old volunteer badge. She moved with such ease through the space that it was clear this was not a first-time occurrence. She went to the drawer where controlled substances were stored, tapped in her access code, and removed a bottle identical to the one I should have taken yesterday morning. The timestamp in the corner showed a date from last year, one of the worst flare-ups I had had that season. My father stiffened but said nothing. My mother kept her eyes on the table. Emily shifted in her seat, her hands pressed flat against her knees. Her expression was cold, but the tension in her jaw gave her away. Lucas let the footage continue. It showed my mother replacing the medication with something that looked similar but lacked the required barcode, then placing the original bottle into her coat pocket, then leaving the room without hesitation. I felt my throat tighten. Even knowing what I had seen earlier in my own home, watching this unfold on screen made the violation feel deeper. Not just betrayal, but intention. Calculated intention. My mother whispered something under her breath. My father looked down at his hands. Then the screen changed. Another clip began to play, this one from the hallway outside the medication area. My father stood near the door, watching my mother step out. He looked directly at her, then glanced toward the camera and walked away, quietly, deliberately. The room seemed to grow smaller around us. Finally, my mother spoke. Her voice cracked around the edges. "Turn it off. This is unnecessary. We can talk privately." But Lucas kept the footage rolling. The next clip was the one that made her entire posture collapse. A recording from inside my house the night before. My mother entering, my bedroom door opening, the drawer sliding out, her hands swapping the bottles, her voice speaking into the phone. "It is done. She will not be able to stand tomorrow." My father closed his eyes. Emily's face drained of color, but she remained rigid. My mother whispered, stop it, please not this video." Her hands were shaking now. No one moved to help her. Lucas finally paused the footage. He let silence fill the room before speaking again. The decision to present this was not mine. It was Mr. Whitford's. All eyes turned toward my grandfather. He lifted his chin slightly and looked at me first, then at my mother. "I asked you over and over to let her be," he said softly, his voice frail but steady. "I asked you to stop interfering. I should have stopped this years ago." My mother shook her head and started to protest, but my grandfather raised a hand weakly, and the motion silenced her. "This is only the beginning," Lucas said. "There is another file that must be reviewed before we proceed." My pulse quickened, the room held its breath. Lucas tapped another key. A new still frame appeared on the screen. The timestamp, old and grainy, read 2011. The image showed the exterior of the Whitford property, captured from a city-installed security camera that I had never known existed. The screen froze on that image, and my heart thudded painfully against my ribs. I did not know exactly what we were about to watch, but every part of my body understood that once it started, nothing would remain the same. Lucas looked at me with something like compassion, then looked toward my grandfather, who gave a faint nod. The clip began to play, and the room went utterly silent. The grainy image flickered for a moment, then sharpened enough for me to recognize the outline of the old storage building behind my grandfather's property. I felt my pulse pound in my ears. The timestamp in the corner marked a late autumn evening in 2011. Though the sound was muted and the colors washed out, a younger version of me stepped into view near the doorway, carrying a box against my chest, as if I had been asked to store it inside. I watched myself with a strange kind of distance, as though I were looking at a stranger who happened to share my face. Then Emily appeared from the left side of the frame. She moved fast, her arms in motion, her posture tight. Even through the grain of the video, I could see the tension in her shoulders. She said something, though the recording had no audio. The younger me stopped walking and turned toward her. My expression was confused at first, then startled. My arms shifted, the box dropping slightly. Emily stepped closer, and the two of us exchanged words I could not hear. Her hands moved as she gestured sharply. I saw myself shake my head. The moment stretched just long enough to make my stomach tighten. Then Emily pushed me. It was not a shove meant to get my attention or jostle my balance. It was a full-force push aimed directly at my shoulders. My younger self stumbled backward. The box hit the ground. I took one step trying to recover, then another, but the momentum carried me down. My back struck the top step of the descending stairwell, and I disappeared from view in a tumbling motion that made the entire room fall silent. I felt the breath leave my body, as if I had been hit again. Watching it was worse than remembering nothing at all. There was no accident, no slip, no startled movement caused by some animal. It was intentional, Emily gasped softly in the seat beside my mother, though she tried to hide it. My mother pressed her fingers to her lips and shut her eyes tightly. My father leaned forward as if he might stand, then settled back, trembling slightly. The video continued. Seconds later, Emily ran into view, peering down the stairwell, clutching her hands together. She looked terrified, but not in the way of someone who feared for a sister. It was the fear of someone who knew exactly what she had done. She backed away, turning toward the house, then returned with my mother, who came rushing in, her face twisted with panic. My mother knelt near the stairwell and looked down at me. Even without audio, I could see her talking rapidly. My father appeared behind her, looking from my body to Emily. He ran a hand over his face and then stepped back as if distancing himself from the entire event. In the video, they did not call out. They did not rush to help. They discussed something feverishly, glancing around the yard. Then my mother pointed toward the old trash bin near the garage. My father nodded and went to move something near the entrance of the stairwell. I watched as they rearranged the position of a broken broom handle and shifted loose garden tools, as if constructing a new version of what had happened. My grandfather let out a thin breath and whispered my name, though he did not speak loudly enough for the others to hear. The video cut out abruptly, and the room remained stunned and silent. I stared at the blank screen, unable to blink. My memory of that night had always been nothing more than shadow and pain. I remembered waking in the hospital, confused and aching, being told I had slipped because of debris on the stairs, hearing my mother say things like "these things happen," and my father telling me I needed to be more aware of my surroundings. But this image in front of me, this truth preserved from the frame of a camera I did not know existed, pierced through every memory I had accepted as fact. Emily broke the silence first. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping across the floor. Her face was pale, but her mouth curled as if she might defend herself. She leaned forward with both hands on the table and said, "You do not understand. It was not supposed to happen like that. I was angry. She would not listen. I never meant to hurt her like that." My mother reached for Emily's wrist and whispered, "Stop talking," but Emily pulled away. She glared at my grandfather. You knew all this time and you said nothing." He looked at her with an expression that was equal parts sadness and resolve. "I wanted to speak. I should have spoken. But your mother told me that if I reported it, CPS would take you. You were young, and she said you would never forgive me if I let that happen." My breath hitched. My mother shook her head sharply. She addressed my grandfather in a trembling voice. "You do not know what you saw. You do not remember it clearly." But he did remember. He looked at me, his eyes lined with sorrow. "I remember enough, and I have lived with the guilt for too long." Emily turned toward me then, her voice rising. "Do you have any idea what it was like to know one mistake could destroy your life? They told me if anyone found out, everything would fall apart. They told me it was the only way to keep the family together." A strange calmness filled me, not forgiveness, not anger either. It was the sensation of threads pulling tight and finally revealing the full pattern they created. Lucas stepped in before anyone could respond. "There is more you need to hear." He clicked to the next file in the folder, but before the image appeared, my mother stood up. "That is enough. We can resolve this privately. This does not belong here." She turned toward my grandfather as if pleading for control. "We do not need to involve lawyers or recordings or any of this." My grandfather met her eyes without flinching. "Yes, we do." It was the first time in my life I had heard that tone from him. Firm, absolute. It cut through my mother's protest like a blade. The next video loaded, showing a different angle of the storage building weeks after the incident. My mother was speaking to a man I did not recognize, handing him an envelope. They walked together toward the back of the yard, where the stairwell had been repaired. The man inspected the area, nodding as my mother spoke. My father stood off to the side, looking at the ground, hands in his pockets. The man left shortly after. My mother remained, gathering the last pieces of the cover story that would shape the next decade of my life. My chest felt tight, but not in the panicked way it had earlier. This was a tighter, colder thing, the realization that the truth had never been lost. It had been buried. My grandfather spoke again, voice tired but unwavering. "I could not live with the lie any longer. I should have protected you, Claire. Instead, I protected the secret." I inhaled slowly and felt the air shake inside my lungs. My entire life had been shaped by what I did not know, by the pain I endured, the doubts that followed me, the voices telling me I was exaggerating or imagining things. And now, here it was, the origin point. On a screen, in front of everyone who had denied it. Emily sank slowly back into her chair, her hands trembling. My mother remained rigid beside her, eyes fixed on the carpet. My father wiped his forehead with the back of his hand and stared at the table. Lucas paused the video. "We still have one more segment," he said quietly. I did not know if I could take more, but I nodded anyway. The truth was unraveling, thread by thread, and for the first time, I could feel my own breath returning to me. Not free yet, not whole, but steady enough to face whatever else waited on that screen. Lucas pressed another key, and the screen shifted to a still frame that looked newer than the others. The lighting was brighter and the image sharper, as if the footage came from a more modern system. My pulse quickened. Everyone in the room sat completely still. Even the soft hum of the projector seemed louder than before. The clip began. It showed the hallway outside my grandfather's room inside Willow Creek. A nurse passed through the frame, then the timestamp jumped to a later hour. Emily appeared at the far end of the corridor. Her hair was pulled into a tight bun, and she held a clipboard as if she belonged there. She moved with purpose toward my grandfather's door. I felt my fingers curl against my palms as I watched her stop in front of the room. She looked around quickly, checking whether she was alone. When she believed she was, she reached into her bag and took out her phone. She typed something, then waited. Seconds later, a text preview appeared on the corner of the screen. It was addressed to me, but the hospital system captured the draft as part of the security audit. The message read that Grandpa was too tired for visitors and that I should postpone my visit until next week. I inhaled sharply. That same evening, I had received that message and felt uneasy about it. I remembered calling the front desk to confirm, only to be told that visiting hours were still open. Emily never admitted sending it. The video continued. Emily tucked her phone away and slipped inside the room. Another camera angle appeared, this one from the upper corner of the hallway. It showed my grandfather sitting upright in his bed, speaking to her. His face looked strained, as if he were trying to explain something important. Emily shook her head and spoke quickly. The camera had no audio, but her gestures were sharp. She pointed at the bedside table, then at the hallway, then back at him. Whatever she said made him sink back into the pillows, defeated. My chest tightened as the video played on. My grandfather reached for the call button, but Emily gently pushed his hand away. She straightened the blanket, looked around again, then walked out. My mother made a soft sound under her breath. My father lowered his head into his hands. Lucas paused the footage. This is from last spring during a time when Mr. Whitford repeatedly tried to contact Claire. Our facility launched an investigation after discovering several phone calls from her had been intercepted or redirected. There is more. He tapped another key. The screen shifted to yet another angle, this time inside the administrative office where patient authorization forms were kept. The timestamp showed a date shortly after the incident in my grandfather's room. The image captured Emily signing a document with my name on it. The form allowed family communication to be limited due to patient request. The handwriting was deliberate, not rushed. The signature looked familiar in structure, but not authentic. The room stayed silent. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. Emily pressed her fingertips into the table, her voice low as she spoke, insisting she had only done what she thought was necessary. She claimed Grandpa had been confused and that she only wanted to help him avoid stress, but her voice lacked conviction and her shoulders were rigid with fear. Lucas allowed the clip to run a few more seconds before stopping it. He looked toward my grandfather, who gave a slight nod. Lucas continued in a steady voice that during the course of our inquiry, we discovered multiple instances of forged authorization and requests to restrict Claire's communication. In each case, the handwriting matched the same documents and the login credentials were traced to devices associated with the family home. My father exhaled shakily and covered his face with both hands. My mother did not look at me. She stared at the blank edge of the table, her fingers stiff and pale. The screen then displayed a new still frame. The moment it appeared, my grandfather lifted his hand a little, signaling that this part mattered most. The image showed the entryway of Willow Creek during early morning hours. A staff member rolled my grandfather through the lobby in his wheelchair while Emily walked beside them. She leaned down and said something that made him look away, his shoulders sagging. She placed a hand on the back of the chair in a way that seemed gentle, caring even, but the staff member's expression betrayed discomfort. Lucas explained quietly that this segment was part of an internal report filed by a nurse who grew concerned about the emotional pressure placed on Mr. Whitford by certain family members. The nurse documented repeated instances where he attempted to reach out to Claire but was discouraged or redirected. My grandfather's breathing grew uneven. I reached for his hand and he grasped my fingers weakly. His skin felt cool, thin as paper. When he spoke, his voice was faint but steady. I tried so many times to tell you. Every time I asked for you, someone stepped in. They told me you did not want to come. They told me you were too busy or too sick or too distant. His eyes glistened. He looked at me again, and the weight of all the years lost pressed against my chest. He whispered that he had believed them for a while, but something in him always wondered. He had asked Lucas to investigate because the unease would not leave him. Emily's composure cracked. She stood abruptly, and her chair slid back. She insisted she did everything to spare him worry. She insisted she was protecting him from my unpredictability. She insisted so loudly that her voice shook. My mother reached out to steady her, but Emily pulled away with a jerk. Her eyes were wild and desperate. She said he would have been heartbroken if he knew the truth. She said she had been carrying the burden for years. She said none of us understood how much pressure she had lived under since she was young. My father made a quiet sound, somewhere between a sigh and a sob. I felt oddly calm, as if I had stepped outside myself. Everything playing out in that room felt both surreal and inevitable. The lies, the manipulation, the years of distance between me and the one person who had always cared for me without question. It was all laid bare now in a way that could no longer be softened or explained away. Lucas let the silence linger before addressing the final piece. "One more clip," he said, his voice softening. "Then we will pause." The screen brightened again. The footage showed the staff room at Willow Creek during a shift change. Two nurses spoke quietly near the counter, unaware of the camera recording them. They mentioned my grandfather expressing fear that if he spoke to me directly, something bad would happen to him or to me. They said he often asked if I hated him. They said Emily always answered on my behalf before anyone could reach me with his messages. My breath caught in my throat. I pressed a hand to my chest, feeling the ache rise not from my spine, but from a place deeper, older. The screen went dark. The room felt hollow, as if something essential had just been pulled out of the air, and none of us could breathe properly without it. My grandfather closed his eyes for a moment and squeezed my hand again. When he opened them, there was grief in his gaze, but also a flicker of something else. Resolve. The same resolve I had seen in him years ago, when he taught me how to sand the old porch railing until it shone again. Slow work, patient work, and always toward something that mattered. I sat very still, listening to the muffled sounds of staff moving down the hallway outside the room. My mother exhaled shakily. Emily wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand. My father stared at the wall as if unsure what part he had played in the life unraveling before him. Lucas turned off the projector. The screen faded to a dull gray. No one spoke for several long seconds. I felt the weight of everything we had seen settle into my bones. The truth was no longer a question. It was no longer a distant suspicion or a shadow flickering at the edge of memory. It stood plainly in front of us now, unmovable and undeniable. And whatever happened next, none of us would leave that room unchanged. Lucas folded his hands in front of him and let the silence stretch until even the air felt tight. My mother shifted in her chair, brushing invisible lint from her sleeve. My father stared at the floor as though he hoped it might open and swallow him. Emily kept her hands clenched so tightly together that her knuckles blanched white. My grandfather breathed slowly, the rise and fall of his chest thin and strained, but his grip on my fingers remained steady. When Lucas finally spoke, his tone was gentle but unmistakably firm. "Before we move to the estate matters, there are legal and procedural issues that must be addressed." My mother straightened abruptly as if bracing to defend herself, but he did not look at her. Instead, he looked at all of them at once. The findings from Tacoma General and Willow Creek were formally reviewed by independent auditors. Several violations were confirmed. unauthorized access to medical records, improper handling of controlled substances, forged authorization forms, interference with patient communication. Each statement felt like a stone dropping into a pond. Rippling through the room, my mother drew in a sharp breath. She lifted her chin, but her voice trembled when she responded. I did what I thought was best. I was protecting my daughter. Protecting me. The words rang hollow in my ears. I felt a strange calm settle over me, the kind that comes when shock has nowhere left to go. Lucas continued, his voice steady. Intent is not the determining factor. Impact is, and the impact in this case was significant harm to a patient. There are consequences. Emily spoke up then, her voice rising too quickly. She was under stress. We all were. That should factor into this. She looked toward my father, expecting support. He swallowed, eyes still downcast. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked. I should have stopped it. I saw too much and said too little. My mother's eyes widened at him, confusion mingling with hurt. You knew the pressure we were under. You knew we were trying to help the family. He shook his head quietly. I knew we were hurting her. For a moment, no one moved. Even the hum of the projector seemed to fade. Lucas opened a thick manila folder. There are also ethical considerations for Mr. Harlow. Witnessing and failing to report suspected medical tampering can lead to disciplinary action from the licensing board. The engineering board is reviewing the matter. My father's face crumpled. He covered his mouth with his hand, a low sound vibrating in his throat. But it was the next section that made Emily's rigid posture finally break. Regarding the forging of documents restricting communication between Claire and her grandfather, Lucas paused to meet her eyes directly. That constitutes medical fraud, an intentional isolation of a vulnerable adult. Emily's lips parted. She stared at him as though she had not understood a single word. But when she spoke, her voice betrayed her fear. I did not isolate him. I kept things calm. He got upset whenever Claire came around. My grandfather shook his head slowly. His voice wavered, but the words were unmistakably clear. I was upset because I thought she did not want to see me. Because you told me that. Emily's breath caught. She stared at him, stunned, as if hearing it for the first time. Lucas continued. These findings have been submitted to the appropriate oversight bodies. Criminal charges have been recommended. In cases like this, the expected outcome is probation rather than incarceration. But there will be a permanent record. My mother covered her mouth with both hands. Emily's shoulders sagged and she let out a shaky exhale. My father lowered his head as if bracing for a blow. Then Lucas closed the folder and lifted a different one. Now, regarding the estate, the temperature of the room seemed to change. My mother straightened again, her eyes darting toward my grandfather. Emily's gaze snapped toward Lucas with the alarmed look of someone realizing too late that the ground beneath her had already shifted. My grandfather squeezed my hand once more and nodded toward Lucas. Lucas read from the will. Mr. Whitford amended his estate plan 6 months ago, in light of what he suspected was happening. He added a moral clause. Any family member who knowingly caused harm or participated in the obstruction of care for Claire within 30 days of his passing would be disqualified from receiving any inheritance. My mother inhaled sharply. Emily's mouth fell open. My father closed his eyes as if absorbing the impact. Lucas continued, because the incidents from Tacoma General and Willow Creek fall well within that time frame. The clause applies. Emily surged forward, her hands splayed on the table. That is not fair. You cannot rewrite an entire future based on things you think you saw. My grandfather lifted his head. It is based on what I did see, and what I allowed to continue for far too long. Emily's face twisted as though she had been struck. She turned to me next. You're going to let them do this to me. I was a child when it happened. I was scared. I did not know what I was doing. I looked at her, really looked at her, and in that moment I saw her clearly for the first time. The desperation, the fear, the denial she clung to like a life raft. But I also saw the choices she had made as an adult. The lies, the manipulation, the cruelty disguised as caretaking. I answered quietly, I am not doing this to you. You did this. She froze. I watched the words sink in like cold water. Lucas resumed reading. Under the moral clause, the entirety of the estate, including the house, investments, and personal assets, passes to Claire I felt the air catch in my lungs. I knew my grandfather valued me. He had always shown me kindness, attention, love, but I never expected this. My mother's eyes filled with something raw. Not grief, not guilt, something closer to panic. Lucas closed the will gently, the clauses final. Silence filled the room once again. It pressed against my chest like a weight. My grandfather turned his head toward me, his voice faint. I wanted you to have one place in this world where you were safe, and I could not give that to you while I was alive. So I am doing it now. I swallowed hard. My throat felt thick and warm, as though I could not take in enough air. I leaned closer to him, keeping my hand wrapped around his. He exhaled slowly, the sound fragile. I should have spoken sooner, Claire. His words trembled in the air, and something inside me shifted. Something deep and long buried. A knot loosening just enough to let breath pass through. Emily sank back in her chair. My mother pressed her fingers to her forehead. My father whispered something too soft to hear. The truth now lay bare between us, unclouded and sharp-edged, and for the first time, I felt the faint stirrings of something I had not felt in years. Strength, steady, quiet, rising from somewhere deep. Lucas rested a hand on the will and looked up. There is one final matter before we conclude. My heartbeat quickened as he reached for a sealed envelope. I did not know what was inside, but I knew it would change everything again. Lucas slid the envelope across the table until it rested in front of me. The paper was thick and cream-colored, sealed with a small embossed mark I recognized from my grandfather's stationery. My fingers trembled slightly as I picked it up. I felt the weight of every eye in the room watching me, but the only gaze that mattered was my grandfather's. He nodded once, slow and tired, letting me know it was time. I broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet inside. His handwriting was shakier than it had been years ago, but still familiar, still undeniably his. I read the note silently, my breath catching halfway through. It was short, almost achingly simple. He wrote that he had left something for me at the old house, something he had kept hidden after the fall in 2011, something he had been too afraid to reveal until now. I felt the sting of tears behind my eyes, but I blinked them back. I folded the note and slipped it into my coat pocket. When I looked up, my grandfather was watching me, his expression soft, as if he were memorizing my face. "Thank you," I whispered. Though barely any sound came out, he nodded again, and I saw a small, tired smile touch the corner of his mouth. Lucas closed the folder and stepped back, signaling that the formal part of the meeting was complete. The tension in the room loosened, but only slightly. My mother stood slowly, smoothing her blouse with trembling hands. She looked at me as if searching for words, but none came. My father rose behind her, shoulders slumped. Emily stayed seated, staring at nothing, her face a pale mask of shock and resentment. No one said anything more. There was nothing left that could ease the weight of what had been shown. I leaned toward my grandfather and pressed my hand gently over his. His skin felt so thin it almost frightened me. He whispered something too soft for the others to hear. "I am so proud of you." Then he closed his eyes, breathing deeply, as if the effort of the morning had drained him more than he wanted to admit. I squeezed his hand once more and straightened. Lucas opened the door, letting in a stripe of bright hallway light. I stepped out first, grateful for the air, the space, the simple act of being able to breathe away from the eyes of my family. The hallway smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee from the break room. For a moment, I simply stood there, letting the quiet settle around me. I walked outside to the courtyard behind the building and sat on a bench near the row of trimmed hedges. The afternoon sun warmed my shoulders. The pain in my lower back pulsed, but the medication Marcus had given me kept it bearable. I closed my eyes and tilted my face toward the light. The truth had cost more than I expected. It had reordered my entire understanding of my life, but it had also freed me in ways I had not realized I needed. I stayed on that bench for a long time until the shadows stretched across the ground. Eventually I stood and walked slowly toward my car, Kane tapping at my side. As I reached the door, my phone buzzed. A text from Emily. I stared at the preview but did not open it. Not yet. Some conversations would take time. Some might never come. And that was something I could finally accept. On the drive home, the world looked strangely clearer. The winter sunlight bounced off the water near Ruston Way. Families walked dogs along the pier. Life continued. indifferent to what had unraveled inside that conference room. When I reached my house, the quiet felt different, not expectant or oppressive, just quiet, a place I could begin to reclaim. 3 days later, my grandfather passed away in his sleep. The call came early in the morning, and even though I knew he had been fading, the news still cut deeply. For a moment it felt like the floor had dropped beneath me, but then something steadied inside my chest. He had spoken his truth. He had given me mine. He had left nothing unfinished. The following weeks passed in a blur of arrangements, signatures, and quiet tears. Neighbors sent flowers. Rose visited every few days, bringing soup and checking on me in that gentle way she had. My mother, father, and Emily stayed distant. The investigation into their actions moved forward, as these things do, slow but inevitable. Letters from various agencies arrived one by one. I read them only when I felt ready. When the estate was settled, the keys to my grandfather's house were placed into my hands. I drove there one afternoon, parking in the gravel driveway beside the old oak tree I used to climb as a child. The house felt unchanged from the outside, still painted a soft blue, still lined with flower beds my grandfather tended every spring. Inside, the air carried that familiar scent of cedar and old books. I walked through the room slowly, touching the back of his worn armchair, running my fingers along the mantel, feeling the memories rise like waves. Then I made my way toward the basement. The door creaked when I opened it. I flicked on the light and stepped carefully down the wooden stairs, gripping the railing tight. At the bottom I paused. The concrete floor was cool beneath my shoes. I scanned the room until my gaze landed on the old workbench against the far wall. On top of it sat a small wooden box. My breath caught. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid. Inside were documents tied together with twine. His handwriting filled the pages. Dates, notes, observations from the weeks after my fall. Records he kept for himself because he could not trust anyone else. A letter to me sat on top. I opened it with care. He wrote about guilt, about fear, about wanting to protect his granddaughter and failing to protect her at the moment she needed him most. He wrote that love is sometimes clumsy and imperfect and late, but still real. And he hoped one day I would understand the difference between the people who hurt me and the people who tried to find their way back. I cried then, not the sharp, hot tears of anger, but the quieter kind. The kind that comes when something inside finally exhales after years of holding itself too tight. I closed the box gently and carried it upstairs. The light outside had softened into evening, streaks of orange stretching across the sky. I sat on the porch steps and breathed in the cool air. For the first time in a long while, I felt still, I felt present. I felt like my life finally belonged to me again. In the months that followed, I began to heal, slowly, unevenly. I took over my grandfather's house and began small renovations, sanding floors, repainting walls, restoring the garden he loved. I continued treatment for my pain without interference. I let conversations with my parents come only when I chose. Emily reached out again, this time with fewer excuses. I responded when I had space to. Healing did not mean forgetting. It meant choosing how to move forward. There is a kind of strength that grows quietly after truth has been spoken. It lives in the way you breathe, the way you take up space in your own life, the way you finally learn to trust the sound of your own voice. And it stays. Thank you for listening to my story. If you have ever carried a truth that no one believed, or navigated a family that tried to shape your life in ways that hurt, I hope you will share your thoughts. Your voice matters here. Your stories matter. Stay with us, and let this community be a place where no one has to face their pain alone.